Hi, how's it going? Welcome to Code with Z. Today's question is LeetCode number 8, string to integer. In this question, we're given a string like so. As you can see, we have 42 in quotation marks and we gotta return the number version of it. But we also have a bunch of edge cases. For example, here we have a bunch of white spaces before the number actually starts, and we also have a negative sign here. So we gotta actually take this into consideration and actually know that we have a bunch of white spaces that we should ignore, and know that our number is negative, and remove this leading 0 and then return minus 42. And if we have something else between our numbers that's not a number, for example this C here, we're just going to return all the numbers before it. So we've actually returned 1337 as you can see here. So long story short, we're going to ignore all of our white spaces and then determine if our number is positive or negative, and then convert all of our string numbers into actual numbers. And then we got to also check that our number lies between the range that was defined to us. Basically, our number has to be greater than this number here and smaller than this number here. Alright, so this is our string and we gotta return it as a number, and these yellow lines are actually the white spaces. I changed the color to kind of differentiate it from this minus sign on the other stuff. So we know that we actually need to return this at the end, so let's define a result variable that's going to be equal to an empty string. This is going to be our variable that we're going to return at the end, and then we have another variable called index, and it's going to be initialized to 0. You're going to see what this does in a bit because I'll visualize the whole process for you, and then at the end our final variable is going to be is negative to check if our number is negative or not. These are all of the variables that we need. Now I'll explain how the algorithm works, and then at the end I'll actually visualize the whole algorithm for you. So in our algorithm, we're going to need a loop. In this loop, we're going to take care of the white space problem. So when we have a white space in the beginning of our string, we're just going to ignore it. For example, we have 3 white spaces here. We gotta ignore it and then actually get to the meat of our string. We're gonna use this code here to ignore all of the white spaces in the beginning. We're gonna say if s of index, s is our string and index is this variable here. We're gonna say if s of index is equal to a white space, increment index, and this is inside of a loop. So this is going to actually ignore all of the white spaces in the beginning. So it's going to check the first white space here, and then it's going to increment index, and then it's going to check the second white space, and so on and so forth until we get to this part, meaning until we've actually ignored all of the white spaces and we get to this part here. Then we're going to take care of the second problem and start our second step, which is checking the sign of our number. And we're going to do it using this logic here. We're going to say if s of index is equal to the plus sign, or if s of index is equal to the minus sign, update the value of negative if we have the minus sign, and then increment the index. So for example, because we have the minus sign here, we're going to update the value of is negative to true. After finishing these 2 steps, we're actually getting to the main meat of our string because we've actually ignored all of the white spaces and we've actually taken care of the positivity or negativity of our number. Now we're getting to the numbers inside of our string, and our index variable is actually updated. So the whole goal is to actually update the index variable throughout step 1 and 2 till we actually get to the main meat of our string, which is our numbers. And then we're going to have another loop, and these 2 loops are not inside of each other, they're actually separate. Inside of this loop, we're going to check if our s of index is between 0 and 9. The whole goal of this line is to check if we have a number or not. So for example, if we have z or o in our string, we don't want that in our result variable. So we're checking to see if what we have here is actually between 0 and 9. And if it is, we're going to add it to our result. Meaning if this was our current character in our loop, we're going to add it to our result because 0 is between 0 and 9. And let's name these 2 loops. So this is going to be the first loop and this one is going to be the second one. And then our final step is going to be rounding the numbers. We got to make sure our result number is going to be less or equal to the upper limit that was defined to us by the question, and be bigger or equal to the lower limit that was defined in our question. And that's all of our algorithm. Now let's visualize it together. So we are in the first round of our first loop, meaning this loop here, and we're checking to see if s of index is equal to a white space. Index is 0, so we're going to check the first white space here, and we're checking to see if it's actually a white space, and we know it is. So we're just going to increment index, and then again we're going to check the second one because we're going to say if s of index is equal to a white space, and index is 1. So we're checking the first index position in our string, and it is still a white space, so we're going to increment index again. And then in our third round, we're going to check to see if this is equal to a white space. It is, so we're going to increment index again. And then we get to our fourth round of the loop and we're checking to see if this is a white space. It's not, so we're just going to break out of our loop like so. Now our index is equal to 3, meaning it's pointing to this position here in our string, and this means we've actually ignored all of the white spaces in the beginning. Then in our second step, we're going to check if s of index is equal to the plus sign or the minus sign, and as you can see, it's equal to the minus sign. So we're going to update the is negative value because s of index is equal to the minus sign. 9. So let's do that. And then we're going to increment index. Now we are 50% of the way. We've taken care of the white spaces and the sign of our number. In our second loop, we're going to start from the index position, not 0, because we've already processed all of this here. And our current index is pointing to the 4th position in our string, which is this one here. So in the first round of our second loop, we're checking the current character that we have. And currently our current character is 0 because our index is 4. And we're checking to see if it is actually a number or not. So is 0 between 0 and 9? It is. So we're going to add 0 to our result. And then we're going to get into the next round. And because of the loop, our loop variable is going to get updated. So this is going to be 5. Now we're pointing to the 5th position in our string, which is 4. And 4 is a number. So we're going to add 4 here. And then we're going to move on to the next one. Now we're currently pointing to the 6th position in our string. And it is 2. And 2 is a number. So we're going to add it to our result. And then we're done with our second loop. Now we have the string version of our result. And we got to turn it into a number. We're going to use the JavaScript number function to turn this result into a number. And this is going to return 42. This number function here actually takes care of the leading zeros as well, so we don't have to worry about that. It's just going to ignore it and actually return 42. And then at the end, we got to check and see if our result, which is 42, is less or equal to the upper limit and bigger or equal to the lower limit. And if our result was actually between the limits that were defined to us, we're just going to return it. Now let's code this in the simplest way possible. All right, let's code this. So first of all, let's define our result variable and initialize it to an empty string. Then let's define our index variable and initialize it to 0. And then let's define our isNegative variable and initialize it to false. Then we're going to define our first loop and we're going to say while s of index, and again, s is just our string that was given to us by the question itself. While s of index is equal to a white space, keep on looping and increment index. This will make sure we ignore all of the white spaces in the beginning. And then after this, we're going to check for the sign of our number. So we're going to say if s of index is equal to the plus sign or s of index is equal to the minus sign, enter this if statement, and isNegative is going to be equal to s of index equaling the minus sign. The reason we don't simply say isNegative is equal to true is because we're going to enter inside this if statement even if our s of index is plus. And we got to make sure isNegative is only true when our s of index is the minus sign. Now you might be asking, then why are we checking for the plus sign anyways? If a number is positive, it doesn't really matter because our default is positive. You're completely right, but we got to also increment index regardless if s of index is the plus sign or the minus sign here. And now we're actually 50% of the way. Then we're gonna define our for loop, and I in our for loop is gonna be equal to the index. Because we've actually done all of this work to make sure that our index is at the correct position. So that's why we're now gonna initialize I to 0 and we're gonna initialize it to index. Because the correct position is this index here. And then we're gonna say, keep on looping as long as I is less than the length of our string, and then I++. We're gonna enter our for loop, and here we gotta check if our current string that we're currently looping through is actually between 0 and 9. And technically we could say if s of I is equal to 9 or s of I is equal to 8, and so on and so forth, all the way until 0. And then inside of it, we're gonna say, if that was the case, add the number to our result. But as you can see, this is not the cleanest way to do it. So what we are actually gonna do is, first of all, let's remove this comment. We're gonna define a number. And here we're gonna say it's gonna be equal to s.carcode at of our I index minus 48. I'm gonna explain what this means now. This here returns anything between 0 and 9 if our current string that we're currently looping through is actually a number. And this basically filters everything that's not a number. So it's gonna filter Z, or for example, O, that might be in our string. Meaning if our s of I is actually the stringified version of our number, it's gonna return it. And if it is not, meaning if our current string is, for example, Z or O, it's gonna return anything that's bigger than 9 or less than 0. And using this, we can write this if statement here. We're gonna say if number is less than 0 or number is greater than 9, break out of our for loop. We're gonna break out of our for loop. Since if this is true means we don't have a number, we're gonna break because we don't want anything that's not a number to be added to our result. Else, we're gonna grab result and it's gonna be equal to result plus s of I. So we're gonna add the character that our for loop is pointing to. Now in the presentation, I called this index because I didn't want to complicate the slides. But as you can see from the code, I is equal to index. And when we actually loop, I is gonna be incremented. After our for loop, we gotta convert our string version of the result into a number. And then we gotta check and see if our result is negative. We gotta multiply -1 to result to make sure we turn it into a negative number and then return it. Else, we're gonna return result itself. So this is using a ternary operator here, and it's like saying if is negative is true, multiply result by -1, and if it is not, meaning if is negative is false, just return result itself. And the final thing we need to do is to check if our number lies between the range that was defined to us here by the question itself. So let's define our limits here. We're gonna say let upper limit be equal to 2 to the power of 31 -1, and then let lower limit be equal to minus parentheses 2 to the power of 31. And again, these two were given to us by the question itself. And it is actually the 32-bit signed integer range. Then in our code, we're gonna say result is equal to if result is bigger than the upper limit that was defined to us by the question itself, again, a ternary operator, then return the upper limit because that's the maximum value that we can have. Else, if result is less than the lower limit that was defined to us, let me drag this here. If result is lower than the lower limit that was defined to us, return the lower limit itself because that's the minimum value we can have. And if that was not the case, meaning if result was less than the upper limit and bigger than the lower limit, just return result itself, and then at the end we're gonna return results. This is all of our code, and let's actually test this now. Moment of truth. Imagine if this didn't work, that would be really funny. As you can see, we'd actually pass all of the tests, and now let's submit it and see what will happen. Drum roll, please. And accepted, and we're beating 64% of all of the other submissions. Let's analyze the time complexity, and time complexity is O of n because we have two separate loops and we don't have any loops inside of each other. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and keep on coding.